Okay, so you want to own a medieval village. You're picturing rolling green fields, a church bell rolling across the valley, peasants tipping their caps as you ride past on your way to collect a fat autumn harvest. Free labor, free rent, free everything. Right up until you open the actual manor rolls. Here's a real number. At the manor of Cuxham in Oxfordshire, in 1288, the Lord's demesne farm brought in about £20 for the year. The Lord's total obligations that same year, to the crown, to the church, and to his own household, came to nearly 18 of it. Read that again. £2 of margin on an entire working village. That's not a kingdom. That's a business running on a £2 cushion. A medieval village was never a treasure chest with peasants attached. It was a fragile, overextended cash flow operation, and most of the men who owned one spent their whole lives one bad August away from losing it. Before you spend a single penny, you need to understand what you're actually buying, because it isn't land. Land on its own, unpopulated and unworked, produced nothing. What you were buying was a manor, and a manor was a bundle of rights over people, not a plot of dirt. You owned the right to demand labor from your tenants for a set number of days each week. You owned the right to force them to grind their grain at your mill, bake their bread in your oven, press their apples in your cider press, each one for a fee. You owned the right to collect fines in your manor court, rent in cash or in kind from dozens of tenant holdings, and a cut of every inheritance, every marriage, every land transfer in the village. Strip all of that away, and the fields are just fields. Nobody was coming to farm them for you out of loyalty. The whole structure of a medieval village was a machine for turning other people's labor into your income. And like any machine, it needed constant maintenance, constant fuel, and a workforce that could, and occasionally did, simply refuse to run it. So let's build one. The year is 1300. You've inherited, bought, or been granted a modest English manor. Call it 500 to 600 acres of arable land split between your own demesne farm and the tenant holdings around it, plus common pasture, woodland, and a scattering of cottages. First, the entry cost. Manors changed hands constantly in this period, through inheritance, marriage settlements, and outright sale. And the surviving deeds give us a decent sense of price. A mid-sized manor with a working village attached could run anywhere from £100 to £300, depending on soil quality, the number of tenants, and whether it came with valuable extras like a mill or a stretch of river with fishing rights. Let's say £200 for a solid, unremarkable manor. Now put that in human terms. An unskilled laborer in 1300 earned roughly 2 pence a day. Do the multiplication, and £200 works out to about 24,000 laboring days, which is close to 90 years of a working man's wages. In a single transaction, you're buying something near a lifetime's income for an ordinary person, and you're buying it in one lump sum before you've collected a single rent payment, before the running costs even begin. Then there's a legal cost almost nobody thinks to price in. A manor did not pass to a new owner for free, not even by inheritance. When a tenant-in-chief died and left a manor to an heir, the heir owed the crown a relief, a lump sum payment often set at a full year's value of the estate, simply for the right to step into his own father's shoes. And if the heir was a minor, the manor could be seized into wardship. That meant the crown, or some favored courtier, took over running the estate and pocketed its income until the heir came of age. And when that day finally arrived, the ward often received his inheritance back stripped of timber, livestock, and cash reserves by a guardian who had no long-term stake in the place whatsoever. Marrying an heiress who held a manor in her own right? That required yet another payment to the crown, this time for the right to marry her at all. None of this shows up in the romantic picture of inheriting your family's ancestral land. All of it shows up in the account rolls, usually as a debt carried over from your very first year of ownership. Now the running costs start, and the first one catches almost everyone off guard. You don't actually run the farm yourself. A lord with any pretensions to status did not walk behind a plow. He hired a bailiff and a reeve, a professional farm manager who oversaw sowing, harvest, and the endless daily disputes of village life. Manorial account rolls from estates like Cuxham and Wistow show bailiffs earning somewhere between 10 and 13 shillings a year in cash, on top of grain allowances and sometimes a cottage of their own. That sounds modest until you add the rest of the payroll beneath him. A dairymaid, a swineherd, a shepherd, an ox herd to manage the plow teams, a hayward to police the common fields and fine anyone who let their livestock stray. And at harvest time, dozens of additional day laborers brought in for a few frantic weeks. A single ordinary domain farm in this period might carry 5 or 6 permanent servants, famuli as the records call them, each drawing a small cash wage plus a grain allowance called a liberatio, roughly a quarter of wheat or rye per week. Above the famuli sat the reeve, drawn from the villagers themselves rather than hired in from outside, a tenant chosen or elected to enforce the Lord's will on his own neighbors, which was every bit as thankless as it sounds, and which explains why manorial records are full of reeves fined for covering up their friends' shortfalls in rent. None of this labor was free. It was simply cheaper than hiring the same number of skilled tradesmen in a town. And cheap is not the same thing as costless. Here's something else nobody accounts for when they picture a medieval lord simply commanding labor for free. Supervision itself was a cost. A villain owed you 2 or 3 days a week on your fields, called week work, plus extra boon work days at harvest and haymaking, when every hand in the village was needed at once. But owed labor is not the same as motivated labor. Manorial court records are dense with entries for tenants who showed up late, worked slowly, sent a child instead of an able adult, or simply claimed illness on the exact days the Lord's hay needed turning before the rain came. A hayward had to be paid to police the common fields for stray animals and unauthorized grazing. And disputes over exactly whose sheep had wandered onto whose strip, or whether a tenant's boon work debt had actually been paid off in full, filled the manor court's docket every single session. None of this labor cost cash wages. All of it cost time, patience, and a bailiff sharp enough to catch corner cutting before it cost you the harvest. And here's where the costs get genuinely interesting, because the biggest line item on most manorial account rolls was not wages at all. It was the plow team. A standard heavy plow in the English Midlands required a team of 6 or 8 oxen, and oxen are not tools you buy once. They're livestock, and livestock eat every single day, whether they're dragging a plow through heavy clay or standing idle in a snowstorm. A working ox in this period ran somewhere around 8 to 10 shillings to buy, and it needed replacing every few years as animals died, went lame, or simply wore out under the work. Now add the iron chairs and coulters that had to be swapped after every hard season, the harness leather that rotted through in wet years, and a smith's fee for every single repair. Suddenly, it makes sense why the customal accounts list iron and plow gear as one of the biggest recurring cash costs on the entire farm. Some years it rivaled the wage bill outright. The plow was the engine of the whole operation, and engines break. And here's something almost nobody accounts for when they picture medieval farming: the seed corn. Before you can harvest a crop, you have to hold back roughly a quarter to a third of last year's yield. Untouched, unsold, never sent to any market, purely to plant next year's fields. On a manor sowing 200 acres of wheat, that could mean setting aside 50 to 70 quarters of grain that had real cash value the moment it came off the ground, and which you were both legally and practically obligated to lock away rather than sell. One bad decision, selling too much grain in a hungry year when prices spiked, could leave a lord without enough seed to sow his own fields the following spring, forcing him to buy replacement seed at market rates from a neighbor, usually at a brutal premium, because in a bad year, everyone else was short of exactly the same thing. Then there's the church, and the church did not wait to be asked. Every manor owed a tithe, 1/10 of all agricultural produce, paid straight to the parish and passed upward through the ecclesiastical hierarchy. This was not a voluntary donation. Tithe barns still stand across the English countryside today, enormous structures raised for the single purpose of storing the church's cut of the harvest before your own grain had even been threshed. Add to that the various dues owed to the crown, scutage in place of military service, tallage levied on domain lands at the king's discretion, and the occasional emergency tax to bankroll a war in France or Scotland that you had no say in and no interest in fighting. None of these obligations cared whether your harvest had failed. The tithe collector arrived on schedule, whatever the weather had done to you. Here's the counterintuitive part, the one that genuinely surprises people. The single most valuable asset on most manors wasn't the plow land at all. It was the mill. Under a legal principle historians call milling soke, tenants were forbidden from grinding their own grain at home with a hand quern and were legally compelled to bring it to the lord's mill, where the miller took a processing fee, typically somewhere between 1/16th and 1/20th of the grain ground, sometimes higher on tightly controlled manors. A single, well-sited watermill, especially one on a river that never froze and never ran dry, could out-earn the entire arable farm surrounding it. Domesday Book itself records thousands of mills across England by 1086, and their value was already well understood 2 full centuries before our village existed. The tenants had no real alternative. Grinding your own grain at home was, on many manors, an offense punishable in the lord's own court, with the confiscated quernstone sometimes built directly into the walls of the manor house as a visible warning. The mill did not care about the weather either. The rain that wrecked a harvest often kept the mill wheel turning that much longer. Now, revenue. This is where the actual business model of a village snaps into focus, and it was far wider than just selling grain. The base layer was rent, paid by free tenants and unfree villains alike. Some in coin, some in kind, plenty in a mix of the two. Stacked on top of that were labor services, the days every villain owed working your demesne fields instead of his own. That saved you cash wages, sure, but it cost you in supervision, and often in resentment and quiet foot-dragging that showed up as thinner yields on exactly the days you were counting on most. Above that came the banal monopolies. The mill fee, the oven fee for anyone baking bread to sell, the fee for using your cider or wine press. Above that sat the manor court, which was no dusty administrative formality but a real, dependable stream of income. Every squabble over a stray pig, every fine for brewing bad ale, every Harriet payment when a tenant died and his family handed over their best beast to hold on to the tenancy. Every merchant fee paid for permission to marry a daughter off the manor. All of it landed in your accounts. And right at the top, for a lord lucky enough to hold a manor near a market town or a river crossing, tolls on any trade moving through your territory. Money that had nothing to do with the harvest, and therefore didn't fail when the harvest did. There was one more stream sitting above all of these, open only to a lucky minority of manors, and when it applied, it dwarfed everything else. If your village sat close enough to a road or a river crossing to justify it, you could petition the crown for a charter to hold a weekly market or an annual fair. A chartered market meant every stall, every trader passing through on market day, every sale of livestock or cloth or grain made inside your jurisdiction owed you a toll. The crown handed out hundreds of these charters in the 13th century alone, and a well-sited market town manor could out-earn an equivalent purely agricultural manor several times over on tolls alone, without a single extra acre under the plow. The catch? A market needs traffic to exist. Traffic needs roads, bridges, and a reputation for safety. And the Lord maintained all of that out of his own pocket, or watched merchants quietly reroute to a rival's market a few miles down the valley instead. The one catastrophic risk sat above all of this, and it showed up with no warning at all in 1315. The Great Famine that hit northern Europe between 1315 and 1317 started with years of relentless rain that rotted crops where they stood, drowned livestock, and turned pastures into swamp. Grain yields across England are thought to have collapsed by as much as half in the worst years. Wheat that might normally go for 5 or 6 shillings a quarter spiked to 4 or 5 times that in the hungriest regions. And here's the part that ruined lords who'd run perfectly sound operations for a decade. Your fixed costs did not drop by half just because your harvest did. The tithe collector still came knocking. The crown's tax demands, if anything, climbed, as the government scrambled for revenue in the middle of a much wider crisis. Your bailiff and your family still needed feeding, and feeding them out of a shrunken harvest meant less grain left to sell, which meant less cash to cover rent shortfalls from tenants who were themselves starving and simply could not pay. Manorial accounts from these years, including the well-documented rolls from Bolton Priory in Yorkshire, show sheep flocks collapsing from disease brought on by the endless wet weather, in some cases losing the majority of the flock inside a single accounting year. A village run exactly according to best practice, everything done right, could still be gutted by weather nobody could control, and there was no insurance policy, no relief fund, no appeal. There's a documented case that puts a human face on precisely that collapse. The account rolls of the manor of Halesowen, studied extensively by the historian Zvi Razi, record tenant after tenant through the famine years falling behind on rent, surrendering their holdings back to the Lord because they could no longer work them, and, in a number of cases, simply vanishing from the record altogether, presumed dead or fled. The court rolls from these years are thick with entries for empty tenements, land that had been worked productively for generations, suddenly sitting idle because there was nobody left alive or present to farm it. A lord holding a manor like that didn't just lose a season's income, he lost tenants. And replacing a vanished tenant family with a new one, willing to take on an unfamiliar, possibly famine-scarred holding at the old rent was no quick fix. Some tenements in the hardest-hit villages stood empty for years, and the lord's own bailiff still had to be paid out of an already shrunken income, simply to keep half-abandoned strips from disappearing under weeds and scrub before a new tenant could eventually be found. The famine didn't strike every village with equal cruelty, and that unevenness is a lesson in itself. A manor with a diversified mix of wheat, oats, and legumes fared better than one staked heavily on a single grain. The relentless rain of 1315 hit wheat and barley hardest, while hardier crops like oats and peas held up somewhat better. And a manor with a mill on a river that kept running, rather than one depending solely on wind or on a stream liable to flood out its own wheel, held on to at least one steady stream of income through the worst years. The lords who came through the famine with their finances intact were rarely the ones who had simply farmed well in ordinary times. They were the ones who had, often by accident of geography rather than foresight, spread their risk across more than one kind of crop and more than one kind of income to begin with. So let's put real numbers on a year, because the shape of the risk only becomes obvious once you see it sitting in a ledger. In a good year, a manor this size might bring in roughly £20 in rent and labor commutation, another £8 from the domain farm's grain surplus sold at market, and £4 or £5 from mill fees, oven fees, and court fines combined. Gross income somewhere near £33. Against that, tithes take roughly a tenth of the agricultural value, call it £2 to £3. Wages for the bailiff and his family run close to £6 across the year. Plow gear, harness repair, and livestock replacement average another £3. Crown taxes and feudal dues in a normal year might claim £2 more. Total it up, and you're left with a surplus in the neighborhood of £17 to £18, a genuinely comfortable margin, enough to reinvest in better livestock, or just live well. An average year looks thinner. Rents run a little behind, as they always did, since some tenants were perpetually in arrears. Grain surplus for sale drops with an unremarkable but real dip in yield, and total income lands closer to £27. Costs barely move because wages, tithes, and plow repairs aren't especially sensitive to a modest dip in the harvest. So they still claim close to £13. That leaves you with something like £14 of surplus. Comfortable, yes, but with a lot less room to absorb a genuine shock. Then comes the famine year. Grain surplus for sale effectively disappears because every spare quarter you have is needed to feed your own household and your own workers rather than sold at market. However tempting those famine prices might look on paper. Rent income collapses too, because tenants who are themselves starving simply cannot pay. And manorial custom in a real crisis often forced lords to grant at least partial remission, rather than evict half the village and be left with fields nobody could work at all. Total income in a bad year might fall to something like £11. Against that, the tithe collector and the crown's tax demands barely soften. Your bailiff and his family still need their grain allowance paid in full, regardless of yield, and total fixed obligations still run close to £10. You're left with a single pound of surplus in the best case, and in the worst villages, during 1315 to 1317, outright deficits, the kind that had to be covered by borrowing against future harvests that had not yet been proven to exist. So who actually got rich running a medieval village? Almost never the lord who simply farmed his domain well and collected his rents on schedule, however competent he might have been. The men who genuinely built fortunes were the ones who treated a single manor as the seed of a portfolio rather than the whole business. They accumulated multiple manors across different regions, so a bad harvest in one county could be offset by a good one in another. They controlled the mill and used that reliable, weather-independent income from milling fees as working capital, lending to their own tenants and to neighboring smallholders at interest during the hard years, quietly acquiring land and loyalty at the same time. They married their daughters to families holding manors adjacent to their own, consolidating scattered holdings into a single, more efficiently managed block. And when the labor shortages that followed the Black Death in 1348 sent wages soaring and tenant bargaining power through the roof, the sharpest operators were the ones who had already begun converting labor services into cash rents years earlier, insulating themselves from a crisis that ruined lords still relying on villain labor that had simply stopped showing up. That shift shows up plainly in the surviving accounts of estates like Sedgeford in Norfolk, where lords who had already commuted much of their labor service into fixed cash rents before the plague weathered the post-1348 wage spike far better than neighbors still trying to compel unfree tenants who now had every incentive, and very often the leverage, to walk to a nearby manor offering better terms. The manor's true owner, in the fullest sense, was rarely the man whose name appeared on the deed. It was whichever creditor, religious house, or neighboring lord held the mortgage, the tithe, or the unpaid arrears once a bad decade finally arrived. A medieval village looked, from the outside, like the most stable, permanent form of wealth a person could hold. Stone church, ancient fields, generations of the same families working the same strips of land. But underneath that permanence sat an operation with almost no slack in it, and all of it hostage to the weather. Nobody really controlled the labor. It could vanish overnight to plague or to famine, and the obligations to church and crown were fixed, never once bending downward to meet a bad year. The village was never the wealth. The wealth was the margin between what it demanded and what it actually produced, and in most years, for most lords, that margin was thinner than anyone standing in the manor house ever wanted to admit.